Prepare yourself for a journey through war and adventure. Follow Fitzroy Maclean as he takes you to the blazing deserts of North Africa. These are his words. Let's begin. We were separated from our base by 800 miles of waterless desert, dotted with enemy outposts and patrols, now all on the lookout for us. We had lost several of our trucks, some of our food, and a good deal of our ammunition. The enemy knew, within a few hundred yards, where we were. 20 miles away in Benghazi, there was an enemy garrison, presumably at that very moment preparing a sortie against us. We had already had a taste of what the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica could do and might expect that the experience would be repeated at frequent intervals all the way back to Kufra. After dark, we were joined by the little party that had attacked the fort. They had succeeded in their task, storming and taking the fort, killing or capturing the bewildered Italians who manned it. But the cost had been heavy. Bob Malot had been badly wounded in the legs and body by a hand grenade. Chris Bailey had been shot through the lung. One of the NCOs, Corporal Ladd, had his arm shattered. All were in considerable pain. The first thing was to get the wounded back to the doctor. We made them as comfortable as we could in the backs of our trucks and set out up the escarpment. It was a nasty drive. Our route led across precipitous country. If we went fast, the pain caused to the wounded by the jolting became unbearable. If we went slow, we risked being caught by daylight, exposed to enemy planes. When I wasn't driving, I sat with Chris, who lay on a bedding roll perched on top of petrol cans and the paraphernalia filling the truck. Though every jolt and lurch hurt him, he was as cheerful and gay as ever. We reached the wadi where we had left the doctor just before dawn. He was there and took charge of the wounded. Everything seemed much the same as when we had left it 36 hours earlier. We divided ourselves between the different wadis, camouflaged the trucks, driving them into patches of scrub or up against rocks and pulling camouflage nets over them. Guardsman Duncan arrived as if by magic with mugs of strong, sweet, thick tea, which he could always be counted on to produce under any circumstances. Then, as dawn broke, we lay down to get some sleep while we could. The first part of the day passed quietly enough. Between inspecting our camouflage and discussing our future movements, I interrogated the Italian prisoners who had been captured in the fort. Like everyone else in the area, they seemed to have had warning of our arrival but failed to connect it with themselves in their cozy little fort. Now that they had time to think, they were terrified, convinced that once interrogated, they would be killed. To them, it seemed inconceivable that anyone in our position would burden themselves with useless mouths or release prisoners who could betray their position. They drew touching pictures of aged parents and chubby children waiting at home and begged us for mercy. Once I reassured them, their attention was distracted by the activities of their own side. After it got light, the air sentries, posted on the hilltops, signaled the first enemy reconnaissance plane searching for us. Others followed, but our camouflage seemed too good for them. We lay quiet behind our respective bushes and stones, feeling more optimistic. If the enemy didn't find us before dark, we would have the following night to gain distance from them, giving us a valuable head start. We were careful not to move or do anything that might give us away. It was then that we saw the jeep. It was one of ours, driving towards us from a neighboring wadi at a good brisk pace, sending up a column of dust. I never discovered who was driving it or why they had set out on an early morning round of visits. We were not the only ones who saw it. An enemy plane had been circling overhead, looking for us in a desultory manner. When it spotted the jeep, it came lower to investigate. The jeep continued its headlong course, dust billowing behind it. The plane circled and then flew off in the direction of Benghazi. Could it be that it hadn't seen us after all? I was sharing cover behind a boulder with a Royal Australian Air Force pilot who had come with us to arrange for air supplies if we needed them. Cautiously, we peeked out. As we did, a burst from the plane's tail gun kicked up the earth around us. We dived back. "This," said the Australian, "is going to be a shaky do." He was right. The enemy had not wasted the night. The nearby airfields had been heavily reinforced, at the expense, we later learned, of frontline troops at Alamein. Before long, the pilot who had spotted us returned, accompanied by a swarm of fighters and bombers. They circled over our wadi, diving down heedless of the small arms fire coming up at them, discharging bombs and cannon into what was left of our transport and anything they could see moving. Lying on that bare hillside under a blazing sun, I felt more exposed than ever. There was no pause for lunch or a midday siesta, or if there was, the pilots worked in shifts, and we didn't notice. My watch had stopped, and the sun seemed to crawl across the sky. 20 or 30 aircraft circled overhead at all times. First one truck, then another was hit and caught fire. Watching the planes and wondering where the next bomb or burst of cannon fire would land, any distraction was welcome. I found myself calculating the minimum number of trucks we needed to get home. As more trucks disintegrated before our eyes, it became clear that it would be a tight fit. Then there was the water and the petrol, can after can spilling into the sand. Shaky do, I thought, summed it up perfectly. Eventually, with sickening deliberation, the sun went down, the last plane cleared its guns and flew off, and we turned to assess our situation. Considering the strength and duration of the air attack, relatively few of us had been killed or wounded. But we were short of transport, food, and water, and our only remaining wireless set had been destroyed. Several trucks were still ablaze, and by their light, we inspected the others. Some seemed repairable. We concluded that if we jettisoned everything except the bare necessities and loaded every jeep and truck to its maximum capacity, there would be just enough transport for everyone. Food and water were in even shorter supply. If we ate and drank barely enough to stay alive, there should be enough to last the 400 miles to Yalor, which, if all had gone well, we should find in the hands of the Sudan Defense Force. If not, we'd have to rethink once we reached Yalor. We decided to focus on the present. Our calculations were interrupted by a torrent of excited Italian. Following the noise, I found our 3 prisoners in tears, holding spades, with a perplexed sergeant standing over them with a Tommy gun. He had decided they might as well be useful and dig graves for our fallen men. However, the Italians, seeing the spades and the Tommy gun, assumed they were digging their own graves. Once again, they required considerable reassurance. Before moving out, we faced a tough decision about the wounded. The journey ahead was long, across rough country under a blinding sun, with the likelihood of running into more trouble. The wounded had already endured one day of air attacks. Were we justified in putting them through further danger and exhaustion? The doctor decided to risk it for Bob Mallow and Corporal Laird. But Chris Bailey and some of the other wounded were too ill to move further. We made them as comfortable as possible, leaving behind a medical orderly and one of the Italian prisoners with instructions to drive into Benghazi under a Red Cross flag and ask for an ambulance. It was a hard decision, and we left them reluctantly. It was a long time before we received news of them, though our rearguard confirmed that the Italians had come to fetch them. Months later, we learned that they had died in a Benghazi hospital. Under the light of the burning trucks, we divided ourselves into 2 main parties, with a smaller third group under David Sterling, who planned to collect stragglers and catch up with us later. After filling our water bottles and destroying anything useful in the derelict trucks, we packed into our vehicles and set off into the night. My jeep carried a crew of 8, all traveling as light as I was. We drove by starlight since we were still too close to the enemy to risk showing a light. There was some initial confusion, les camions français par ici. But we soon got going. We didn't make much progress that night. The going was rough, and there was no moon. It was clear that our best course would be to move to the southern edge of the Giebel, where we could find cover and lie low for another day, hoping to throw the enemy off our scent before embarking on the long trek across the open desert. Just before dawn, we halted in a likely wadi, camouflaged the trucks, and settled into the scrub and rocks to wait. In the desert, the transition from darkness to light is rapid. Soon, the sun was beating down fiercely, and the flies returned. Time passed slowly. The night before, we had worked out a ration scale to stretch our supplies to Yalor. Each man was allowed about a cup of water and a tablespoon of buri beef per day, with rations eaten only in the evening. By now, after 48 hours of scant food, we were all fixated on the evening meal. The time was barely 6 a.m. Gordon Alston and I climbed to the top of a nearby hill, from which we had a view of the surrounding country. We made ourselves as comfortable as possible inside a Bedouin stone shelter. A ground sheet gave us some shade, and as the sun moved, we moved the sheet to keep pace. The flies buzzed incessantly. I felt sweat trickling down my spine and couldn't stop thinking about food, or drink. I imagined long, cold drinks in tall glasses with ice clinking against the sides. Our daydreams were interrupted by the sound of bomb bursts and machine gun fire. We saw, miles away, a swarm of enemy aircraft circling like wasps. First one column of smoke, then another rose as they found their target. Either Paddy Mayne or David Sterling was catching it again. A fighter, on its way to join in the fun, flew right over us without seeing us. Eventually, the aircraft went away and did not return. In the distance, We could still see the smoke from the burning trucks curling up into the sky. Once more, we settled down to wait for darkness. From high in the sky, the sun blazed down on us, and the flies were worse than ever. Whenever one of us hit out at them, the ground sheet fell down on us. Time passed very slowly. We watched the sun reach its meridian, stay there for what seemed like an unconscionable time, and then, almost imperceptibly, begin to sink lower. The aircraft did not return. In a few hours, it would be dark. We gave up thinking of imaginary meals and began to visualize our actual rations, the bully beef, the biscuit, and the cup of water. Time passed slower than ever. Later, we made an exciting discovery: 2 small, very dirty bits of half-melted barley sugar, forgotten in the pocket of my greatcoat. We ate them greedily. They seemed as stimulating as a stiff whiskey, probably because we hadn't had much to eat for some time. At last, the sun set, sinking below the horizon as quickly as it had risen. In the sudden dusk, we walked down from our hilltop toward the ration truck, where a small group was already gathering. The big moment of the day had arrived. But it was soon past. A spoonful of bully beef is quickly eaten. The camouflage nets were pulled off the trucks and stowed away, and, feeling refreshed though by no means sated, we started the next stage of our journey. After much floundering about in the dark, including 1 or 2 abortive excursions up wadis that turned out to have no outlet and various other misadventures, we finally emerged from the Gebel into the open desert. The going, by comparison, was now quite good, and in the early hours of the morning, by the light of a waning moon, we considerably increased the distance between ourselves and the enemy. Dawn found us in the middle of a perfectly flat expanse of gravel stretching as far as the eye could see, dotted here and there with solitary, scrubby, leafless bushes about 18 inches high. There can be few places in the world with less natural cover. Hurriedly, before it was quite light, we dispersed the trucks as widely as we could. Then, pulling over them their camouflage nets, enlivened with an occasional twig, we proceeded to convert them into what we optimistically hoped would look like a series of natural mounds or knolls from the air. Having done this, we lay down and composed ourselves hopefully to sleep. Fortunately, on this occasion, our powers of camouflage were not put to the test. Inexplicably, no aircraft came our way. Our slumbers were interrupted only by the usual flies, which appeared from nowhere, buzzing gaily in the sun. I spent an hour or so talking to Bob Mallow. He had suffered a good deal from the heat and the jolting, and he was too weak to hold his own against the flies. But he was as cheerful as ever and talked confidently about getting back home to Alexandria. His cheerfulness made one forget one's own minor discomforts. It was September 17th. At nightfall, we ate our rations and started off again. We kept going all that night and the following day. It was a risk to drive by day, but with our supplies of food and water as low as they were, it was a risk we had to take. It was very hot, and the soft sand swirled up at us, as though a sandstorm were threatening. With 7 or 8 of us packed into a jeep, it wasn't easy to relax, even when not driving. The sun blazed down relentlessly from a brazen sky. Occasionally, someone would fall asleep and tumble off, and we had to stop, waiting irritably while they picked themselves up and climbed back on. The tires, too, were beginning to feel the strain after so many hundreds of miles of rough terrain under the hot sun, and punctures came with increasing frequency. Changing a wheel or digging the jeep out of soft sand began to seem more and more arduous as we grew weaker. Our throats were dry and even speaking required effort. We counted the hours and minutes separating us from the blissful moment when we could next allow ourselves to take a pull at the rapidly dwindling supply of warm, dirty, brackish water in our bottles. When we halted at dusk on September 18th, after driving more or less continuously for 24 hours, we had covered a considerable distance. We were now not more than 20 or 30 miles from Yalor. Tracks in the sand, apparently made by heavy Italian trucks, led in the direction of the oasis. Once again, we took stock of our position. We had very little petrol left, and enough food and water for only one more meal. Another 400 or 500 miles separated us from Kufra. Everything now depended on what we found at Yalor. If it was still in enemy hands, the outlook would be grim. Our meal that night was more luxurious than anything we had tasted for some time. In addition to the usual spoonful of bully beef, we used some of our remaining water to make hot porridge and brewed up some tea. We also scraped up enough rum for a small tot all around. This we drank after supper, lying on a little sandbank and watching the sun sink behind the dunes. We had all been feeling a bit low, but this unexpected treat restored our spirits. I, for one, We'll always recall it with pleasure. Indeed, looking back over a varied gastronomic experience, from strawberry messes at Eton to sheep's entrails in Central Asia and the more sophisticated fare of La Rue and La Perse, I cannot remember a meal I enjoyed more or one that seemed so wildly and agreeably extravagant. Extravagant it certainly was, for when we had finished, there was no food left at all, and only enough water to half-fill one water bottle per man. The next step was to unobtrusively ascertain the situation at Yarlaw. Sandy Scratchley and I decided to take 2 jeeps and investigate. Sandy had come to the SAS from the 4th County of London Yeomanry. After a brief career as a regular soldier before the war, he had left the army to become a steeplechase jockey, a profession in which he quickly made his mark. He boasted that he had broken every bone in his body and that he was the best-dressed man on the turf. There seemed little reason to doubt either claim. One of the Sterling family's more spectacular motor accidents had accounted for most of the limbs that had escaped fracture in a long series of racing accidents. Even at this stage of our adventures, with his shirt and an old pair of corduroy trousers, a straggling reddish beard, and sand clogging his curly reddish hair, Sandy managed to evoke an appearance somehow reminiscent of Newmarket. We cleaned our Vickers K guns, drew our ration of water, filled up with petrol, and started off, leaving the rest of the party to await our return. In my jeep came Sergeant Seekings, the Cambridgeshire farmer and old SAS operative whose injured hand had caused him to be left behind when we first visited Benghazi in the spring. In my pocket, I carried my teaspoon, hoping I would soon find a use for it. It was midnight when we set out. Our goal was to get as close to the oasis as we could under cover of darkness and try to determine who held it. If we ran into an Italian patrol, we planned to make a hasty retreat. If we were challenged by Sudanese, we would have to try to make them understand who we were, which, in the dark and without a common language, promised to be a tricky task. There was no moon, and we navigated by the stars, with one man looking out while the other drove. Mike Sadler, our navigator, who had started us off, told us that if we kept a westerly course, we shouldn't have much trouble finding the oasis, which covered a relatively large area. After jolting along in the dark for several hours, Sergeant Seekings, who was keeping watch, drew my attention to a flash of greenish light across the sky in front of us. He said it was a green very light, our usual recognition signal. The other jeep had seen it too. They had initially taken it for a shooting star but were no longer sure. Should we assume it was a signal and reply with the appropriate red, followed by green light, an unwise action if there were any enemies nearby? Or should we dismiss it as an astronomical phenomenon? In the end, Seekings won the argument. Our very pistol was produced and fired twice. First, a red star soared into the sky, then a green one. They blossomed out, illuminating the surrounding desert, and then faded away. We settled down to wait for a response. None came. The shooting star camp made no effort to hide their triumph and went on about the folly of advertising our position to everyone in central Libya with uncalled-for fireworks. Before going any further, we checked our position as best we could and concluded we must be near the edge of the oasis. There seemed little to gain by pressing on in the few remaining hours before dawn. Indeed, it seemed likely that doing so could lead us into unnecessary trouble. We revised our plan and decided to stay put until just before first light. We took turns keeping watch while the rest slept. By now, we were all very tired and grateful for the rest. Before going to sleep, I finished the last of my water. It was a comfort to take a good, long pull after so many days of sipping. As I drained the last tepid drops, I reflected that the next day was likely to solve our water problem one way or another. The brief grey twilight before dawn revealed, as expected, the palm trees of Yarlaw, a few miles away on the western horizon. Nothing else was in sight. There were no signs of human activity. We got back into our jeeps and cautiously drove toward the oasis. Half an hour of driving brought us to the outer edge. A little wind was stirring the palms, the sky was limpid. Still, we saw nothing. We were wondering what to do next when we heard the familiar sound of aircraft engines. Looking toward the horizon, we saw 3 bombers flying in formation, straight for us. We had barely gotten the jeeps under cover of the palms when they were overhead. Looking up, we saw they bore German markings. It occurred to us that here was a simple way to find out who held the oasis. If the Germans bombed it, we could safely assume it was in the hands of our own troops. If they landed, dropped supplies, or did nothing, we would know it was still in enemy hands. The bombers made a pass over the oasis, flying so low over the palm trees that from our hiding place, we could see the faces of the pilot and rear gunner. We watched them intently. Nothing happened. We could see through the palm trees to the flat sand of the landing strip, which was empty except for the wreckage of a fighter. If they landed now, we'd have a ringside seat, and we'd have to think fast. As we watched, they circled out over the desert and came back for a second pass. Once again, they flew over us at low altitude and disappeared over the palm trees. Then, just as we were about to give up hope, came the crash and roar of 3 sticks of bombs. I never thought I would take such pleasure in the sound of German bombs bursting so close. The attack was brief and intense, and soon the 3 aircraft, having dropped their bombs, turned and flew off toward the north, leaving the coast clear for us to make contact with our friends in the Sudan Defense Force. We now felt certain they must hold the oasis. Rising above the palm trees about half a mile away, we could see the little Italian fort that marked the center of Yalor. We prepared to go, licking our lips at the thought of the food and drink awaiting us there. The Sudan Defense Force always lived well, and there would be captured Italian rations too. We scrambled back into the jeeps and started the engines, only to hear an unexpected sound, the screeching of a salvo of shells. We watched as they burst squarely on the fort. At that moment, the comfortable certainty we had gained from the hostile behavior of the German aircraft gave way to fresh doubts. If the Sudan Defense Force had captured the fort, why was there any enemy left to shell them? We decided it would be wise to investigate further before driving up to the fort for breakfast. All of this had happened so quickly that we had barely had time to look around. A closer inspection of our surroundings revealed a solitary Arab, half-heartedly tilling a small, unpromising vegetable patch some distance away under the palm trees. I walked over and engaged him in conversation. In a mix of Italian, soldiers' Arabic, and gestures, I asked who was in the fort. Togliani, he replied curtly, with evident disdain for someone so out of touch with local events. And what about the English? I asked. The English tried to get in several days ago, he said. And now, he added, turning back to his digging as another salvo of shells whistled in, they're trying again. This cleared things up. We were, it appeared, occupying part of the Italian advanced positions and under heavy fire from our own side. The Italians themselves had wisely abandoned these positions at some earlier stage of the fight. The sooner we followed suit, the better. But that was easier said than done. Quite a few short shells were coming our way, and the shallow, rather smelly little trenches we found ourselves in were no place to relax. On the other hand, the sudden appearance of 2 stray jeeps silhouetted on the skyline would make an irresistible target for both sides. We decided to stay put and wait for a lull in the fighting. Time dragged slower than ever in our new surroundings, and we became painfully aware of hunger and thirst. The Arab seemed our only possible source of refreshment. I cautiously made my way over to him again, as things were heating up around us, and began negotiations. The first thing to do was find out where he kept his water. It turned out there was a well beside his allotment. Lying on the sand, with the help of an old leather bucket and a long bit of string, I soon pulled up enough water to fill 2 large bottles. The slimy, brackish liquid seemed more delicious than vintage champagne. At least, for the time being, the water problem was solved. Next, I asked if he had anything to sell us to eat. A man of few words, he pointed to a bright green vegetable marrow growing at his feet. Any eggs? I asked. No, he replied. It was clear that the marrow was all we were going to get. Eventually, it changed hands for 1,000 lira note. It wasn't cheap, but it was the smallest note I had, and I couldn't expect change in the circumstances. Carrying it as proudly as if it had won a prize at the Crystal Palace, I made my way back to the jeeps by a suitably circuitous route. Along the way, I filled my pockets with unripe dates from the palms. We now had all the makings of a feast. We had barely sat down to breakfast when a fierce argument broke out over our plat de resistance. I claimed it was a vegetable marrow, but Sandy brushed this aside, saying it was a cucumber. When I told him cucumbers didn't grow that large, he replied that anyone who knew anything about vegetables could see it was a tropical cucumber. Annoyed, I retorted, rather unfairly, that anyone who knew anything at all could see he was just a city slicker whose knowledge of the countryside came solely from the low suburban racecourses he frequented. Prolonged lack of food and drink is bound to fray tempers. We were all on edge, and Sandy and I were close to using what little strength we had left to fight over the identity of the rather sad-looking vegetable, now cut into unappetizing green slices covered in sand and flies. Fortunately, a breach of the peace was avoided thanks to Sergeant Seekings, the only real agricultural expert among us. He drew the ire of both parties by suggesting the object of our dispute was a type of pumpkin, an idea so absurd that Sandy and I quickly abandoned our own argument in a futile attempt to convince Seekings he was talking nonsense. Not long after eating it, whatever it was, we all suffered from severe stomach aches. It turned out to be a most unsatisfactory vegetable. While waiting for an opportunity to make a dash for it, we took turns reading from a volume of excellent short stories by the late Damon Runyon that Sandy had brought with him. The Misfortunes of Good Time Charlie, Harry the Horse, and others at the hands of less peaceful characters helped distract us from our predicament. Still, 2 stories made for painful reading. One was about an eating contest, the other concerned a man whose favorite drink was rock candy and rye whiskey, without the rock candy. We reflected sadly on what we wouldn't give at that moment for some rye whiskey, or, for that matter, we weren't fussy, for some rock candy, whatever it was. It took some time before a suitable opportunity to leave our hiding spot arose, but when it did, we quickly decamouflaged the jeeps and set off. Once we were clear of the trees, we drove as fast as we could and managed to get away unpursued. We had formed a good idea of the enemy's approximate position, and we now made our way there after taking a wide sweep into the desert to approach from a better angle. The first thing we saw was a number of burning trucks, set alight by bombs or gunfire. Vainly trying to extinguish the flames, we found one of the Sudan Defense Force officers, who told us the whole story. Just as we had experienced at Benghazi, the SDF had approached their objective to find the entire garrison of Yalor waiting for them at their machine guns behind a new and well-placed minefield, clearly expecting an attack. Despite this, the SDF had managed to fight their way inside the fort, only to be thrown out again with heavy losses. They had since withdrawn and regrouped, and after shelling the Italians all day, while being shelled in return, they were preparing to launch another assault on the fort as soon as it got dark. They invited us to join them. We eagerly agreed, saying we would go fetch the rest of our party and be back in time for the evening's proceedings, provided they gave us some food and water first. They kindly supplied us with bully beef and biscuits, and we drove off triumphantly, with Seekings and me taking alternate stabs at the open tin of bully with my teaspoon. But by the time we had found the main party and rejoined the Sudan Defense Force, a fresh development had forced a change of plans. The SDF had received a signal from GHQ, Middle East. The first paragraph ordered them to abandon the assault on Yalor and return to base immediately. This news was disappointing. However, the reason for the order, detailed in the second paragraph, surprised and delighted us. Strategically, we were told, our respective operations, disastrous as they seemed from a tactical point of view, had already achieved their main goal. They had caused the enemy to divert disproportionate numbers of aircraft and troops from the front, forces that would otherwise have been used to counter certain operations now being undertaken by the 8th Army. These operations, we learned later, were the preliminary steps that would soon culminate in the grand attack on Rommel's lines at El Alamein. Thus, viewed in the context of the larger war effort, GHQ's decision to stick to the original timetable, regardless of our losses, became understandable. It reminded me of my sergeant instructor's words in the early days at Inverness: we were nothing but cogs in a giant, grinding machine. Later, upon our return to civilization, we were amused to see our operation described in the popular press in glowing terms that made it scarcely recognizable. Meanwhile, the third paragraph of the signal brought us news of more immediate interest. It appeared that we had succeeded in diverting not only enemy aircraft and infantry but also a column of armored cars, which were now scouring the desert for us. With this information, the order to withdraw seemed all the more sensible, and we pressed on with preparations to leave. These were simple. With several trucks still burning in the dusk and a machine gun rattling half-heartedly from the fort, we collected dates from the surrounding palm trees, drew as much water as we could from the nearest well, borrowed as much petrol and rations as the SDF could spare, and then, piling back into our jeeps and trucks, we formed a column and drove off southward into the gathering dusk. Our encounter with the SDF had made it just possible for us to continue, but only just. After pooling all our available petrol and rations, we still weren't sure there would be enough to get both units safely back to Kufra. There was no hope of improving our standard of living. Bully beef would continue to be rationed by the spoonful, but water, at least, was more plentiful than it had been in some time, and we had every hope of finding more along the way. With aircraft and armored cars still on the prowl, it was advisable to put as much distance between ourselves and Yalor as possible before dawn. There was no moon, and to save time, we decided to take the risk of being spotted by using our headlights and driving as fast as we could. My memories of that night's journey are hazy but wholly unpleasant. A few yards ahead, illuminated by the red glow of the tail lamp, the bearded, sand-encrusted faces of the men huddled on the jeep in front of us bobbed and jolted in the darkness like puppets in a peep show. The soft sand billowed up, and in the headlights' glare, it formed itself into fantastic shapes. Hunger and exhaustion playing tricks, I began to imagine our headlights lighting up not the desert but a narrow lane bounded by high hedges, with overhanging trees and the occasional house. Sooner or later, I would find my eyes irresistibly focusing on one point in this non-existent landscape, drifting further and further from reality, until a sudden jolt would bring me back to consciousness. At that point, if I were driving, it was time to hand over the wheel and climb into the back to doze fitfully, clutching at the guns to keep from being thrown off. First light found us in a scene no less surreal than my nighttime imaginings. We were in the middle of what looked like a desert archipelago. The flat, sandy desert stretched out like a seabed, from which rose a cluster of islands with towering cliffs crowned by unfamiliar greenery, shrubs and even small trees. Against the dazzling blue sky and the white expanse of sand, the scene reminded me of early religious paintings of the Thebaid. I half expected to see hermits and demons emerge from the caves dotting the sides of these strange little hills. Insects of every kind abounded, yet there was no sign of water. This must have been what remained of a dying oasis, somehow cut off from its original water source. The maps showed no trace of it. Here we spent the day, undisturbed by the enemy. The high, overhanging cliffs provided ideal hiding places for our trucks. Sleep, however, was another matter. As soon as we arrived, the insects, their appetites sharpened by a lifetime of scarcity and now excited by the prospect of an undreamed-of feast, descended on us. The rest of the day was spent in futile attempts to fend them off. At dusk, we ate our food, shared our dwindling supply of water with the thirsty radiators of our trucks, and set off again. That night's journey was a repeat of the previous one, the same struggle to stay awake at the wheel, the same clouds of dust playing tricks on our imaginations in the headlights, the same frequent halts to deal with punctures. Just before dawn, we stopped for an hour's sleep. Then, deciding we were far enough south to risk traveling by day, we set off again, this time following the line of beacons set up by the Italians before the war to mark the route from newly captured Kufra to Yalor and the coast. Here and there, little heaps of bleaching bones testified to the caravans that had passed this way for generations. By evening, we reached Zion and the oasis of Bir Harash, where the SDF was already installed. To us, this fly-infested patch of scrub in the middle of a howling wilderness seemed like a veritable outpost of civilization. Not only was there an unlimited supply of brackish water to drink, but in the distant past, some visiting patrol from the long-range desert group had opened up one of the wells and, using flattened petrol cans, converted it into a tin-lined bathing pool. Here, sharing our bath with a crowd of splashing Sudanese, our feet slipping in the slime at the bottom, we enjoyed the closest thing to a proper wash we had had in a long time. The rest of our homeward journey was relatively straightforward. There was no longer any doubt that our supplies of food, water, and petrol would last, and as we moved farther from the coast, the threat of enemy interference diminished. We remained on the lookout for aircraft, and sure enough, a few days later, a bombing raid caused significant damage and several casualties at Kufra. From Zion, we plunged once more into the dunes and valleys of the Sand Sea. Unsticking the trucks had been a tiresome task when we were fresh. Now, exhausted, it was a nightmare. We were relieved to see the last of the Sand Sea. The next day, we found ourselves among black cliffs and towering red sandstone pinnacles. With luck, we would reach Kufra the next morning. That night, we lay down to sleep on a soft patch of sand, feeling a new and not altogether comfortable sense of security, knowing how it would all end. Some of the more musically inclined members of the party celebrated our last night out with a sing-along. As I drifted off, the rich tenor of Sergeant Phillips, a regular offender on such occasions, carried across the desert as he soulfully crooned the green eye of the little yellow god. In the end, we didn't reach Kufra until the following evening. So far, both our tires and the vehicles themselves had held up remarkably well given the battering they had taken, but now both began to fail, and the short journey took us all day. Every few minutes, the blare of a horn would alert us that another truck or jeep had broken down, either with a puncture or a mechanical failure. The whole convoy would grind to a halt while repairs were made. With increasing frequency, the shout of Fitter's jeep would ring out, and Sergeant Lilly, our dark, wiry, efficient chief fitter, would dash up with his team of experts to perform what seemed like miraculous repairs on the battered, sand-caked engines. Even a puncture was a serious problem now. Spare wheels and jacks were a thing of the past. Each time, the truck or jeep had to be lifted by sheer muscle, the wheel taken off, the tattered tube patched and repatched, and put back on. At the start of the journey, 4 men could easily lift a jeep. Now it took 8 of us, and the more punctures there were, the more exhausted we became. Tempers frayed, with Guardsman Duncan the only one who remained completely unruffled, as time and again, our jeep came to a halt with its klaxon sounding, and all 8 of us had to climb down to heave, pull, and wrench at the offending wheel. It was late by the time we finally reached Kufra, and after completing the necessary formalities, we were all too glad to collapse wherever we could under the palm trees and sleep. The next day was memorable. After a long lie-in and a swim in the lake, we lined up for breakfast at an improvised cookhouse under the palms. Porridge, laced with whiskey, was followed by eggs from the Arab village, bacon, and sausages. Then came bread, Australian butter, and marmalade, and finally, tinned pineapple, which had been produced by a benevolent quartermaster. This bounty, piled high on borrowed mess tins, was washed down with copious mugs of strong tea, thick with condensed milk and sugar, drunk from elegant enamel mugs. This last refinement was a welcome contrast to the empty bully beef tins we had been reduced to using lately. When we finished, we strolled over to where the other parties were camped to hear how they had fared. All had reached Kufra within a few hours of us, and like us, they were reveling in the newfound luxury of a life of leisure. Paddy Main's party had returned without incident. David Sterling had waited as long as he could in the Giebel, confirmed that the wounded we had left behind had been picked up by the enemy, and then, after gathering any stragglers he could find, had brought up the rear. The other raiding parties from Kufra had fared no better than we had. David Lloyd Owen's LRDG patrol had been tasked with escorting a group trying to bluff their way into Tobruk disguised as Germans, while a larger force landed simultaneously by sea. Lloyd Owen had navigated his group safely across the desert to Tobruk, but the party never returned. After waiting as long as possible, he had been forced to withdraw without them. From the pandemonium he described breaking out in Tobruk when the group entered, it was clear the enemy had been expecting the attack, just as they had been in Benghazi. We were right. The Tobruk operation, like our own, had been anticipated by the Germans and had gone awry. Matters were worsened by bad weather, which hampered the naval aspect of the mission. 2 destroyers and 4 motor torpedo boats were lost, and those troops who made it ashore were captured. Of the desert party, John Hazelden, the commander, was killed. Tommy Lambton of the Irish Guards and David Russell of the Scots Guards managed to escape and, after an epic trek, made their way safely back to the British lines at El Alamein. There was, however, one bright spot. 2 LRDG patrols from Fayoum, led by Jake Easonsmith, had crossed the entire Sand Sea and, emerging at the northern end, launched a devastating surprise attack on the Bache airfield, 50 miles east of Benghazi. They put the fear of God into the garrison and destroyed 30 aircraft on the ground. David Sterling, characteristically, was already full of fresh ideas for future operations. He was turning over plans for more desert raids, operations in Europe, and even missions in Persia, should the Germans advance that far. Later that day, he flew to Cairo, and Bill Cumper, Guardsman Duncan, and I went with him. With us, on stretchers, were Bob Mallow and Corporal Laird, who had both endured the journey back with immense fortitude and were now headed to the relative comfort of a general hospital. We reached Cairo the next day, still unshaven, unchanged, and barely washed. The only transport available at the airport was a 1,500-weight truck, so we all piled into the back, a thoroughly disreputable-looking bunch. Someone needed to be dropped off at Shepherd's Hotel, and when we pulled up, the terrace was packed with a well-dressed crowd. It was then we overheard someone indignantly ask, "Why is there no proper guard on that grubby batch of German prisoners?" Clearly, it was time for us to get a wash and brush up. That concludes the 5th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.